In this presentation, I want to talk about an introduction to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible or the Bible, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So this then should be an introduction to the whole collection, because we're going to be dealing with each of the books individually. So this is just an introduction to the 5. The Torah presents human history as a progressive revelation of the divine will. I think that this is very important, and this is a topic that very often is forgotten by people, that what we have in the Bible is a progressive revelation. We don't have the whole package given once and for all time, but we have a progressive understanding, almost as what one would do with children's literature. The way that you introduce your kids to literature, to reading, is by giving them very basic books at the beginning, reading when they are maybe 1 or 2 years old, a lot of pictures, not too many words, and then it is only later that as they are growing up, as their brain is maturing, as they are acquiring more vocabulary, more language, that you start giving them more complicated stories. Similarly, that's what we have in the Bible, really. It's a progressive revelation. Moreover, the Torah, and when I say Torah, I mean the first 5 books of the Bible, emphasizes both promises to those individuals, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their spouses, as well as to future generations, their descendants. And something that we're going to see in this collection is that the relationship between God and these individuals is defined as one of covenant, is one of agreement, of a pact that is cut between God and these individuals. It is also important, and we're going to be seeing this in a second, that the Torah is not the composition of one single individual, although that is traditionally the view. Today we understand that the Torah is a composite work, written probably over hundreds of years by many hands. The label Pentateuch comes from the Greek, which means 5 scrolls. And we're not going to trace a very detailed mapping of the collection right now, because we're going to be dealing with each of the books individually in the next few days and weeks. But the collection begins with stories of creation. Then it very, very quickly narrows or zooms in onto a particular family. So it begins with a very large, encompassing view of creation of the world, then focuses on one family, and God's dealing with this one family. Then most of the Pentateuch then focuses on Israel's origins and its evolution into what is expected, which is that Israel will become a holy nation that will live by the principles, by the ideas of its covenant relationship with Yahweh. Other major themes include promises that God makes to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and as we suggested, then the ongoing relationship with their descendants, with the Israelites. Let's talk briefly about the vows. These vows are promises that God makes to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that include the following, although some of the episodes that contain these promises may skip one or the other of these elements. In general, this is what we will see in several of these. We find the promise of a son and descendants afterwards. We call these progeny. The promise of divine presence for these individuals and their descendants. The promise of land. The promise of a blessing. So, for instance, that Abraham is going to be a blessing to the whole world. And then covenants. And we find a number of covenants in the Pentateuch. Let's talk about literary forms. This is important in biblical studies to be able to recognize what a form is, what the particular genre of a text is, because if you determine the genre to a large extent, you will be able then to interpret that one text in view of the characteristics of the genre, of the form. So we find narratives. Narrative is familiar to most of us from short stories, from novels. You have characters, you have a plot. A plot generally involves protagonists and antagonists. You also include some sort of conflict and then a resolution. And we find a number of narratives throughout the Pentateuch, very well constructed ones. As a matter of fact, in the book of Genesis, for instance, we have a number of stories concerning Joseph, and these have been very carefully constructed narratives that contain most, if not all, of the elements that I just described. Genealogies refer to lists of descendants, so we find a number of them. Several of them are concentrated in the book of Numbers, and that should not surprise us. Etiologies refer to stories, little vignettes that very often explain why something happened or happens. So, for instance, in Genesis 3, the story of Adam and Eve and their disobeying God, we find what happens afterwards. So, for instance, in the aftermath of that event, God tells Eve that she's going to have pain and labor. Then God tells Adam that he's going to have to work very hard, that he's going to have to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, that his labor is going to be intense and difficult from that point forward. Then we have the etiology of why snakes slither or crawl on their bellies as a result of God's curse on the snake. Itineraries refer to travel lodges, and we find a number of them also scattered throughout the Pentateuch, itineraries for both individuals as well as for the nation of Israel, where they stayed, what they found there, how long they stayed, and where they journeyed afterwards. As I had already suggested, the Pentateuch is attributed to Moses, although today most scholars actually suggest that it could not have been Moses. There are a number of issues with that. For instance, the fact that Moses talks about his own death at the end of Deuteronomy. Well, one generally is not able to talk about one's own death because when you're dead, you're dead. You are not doing two things at the same time. You're not both dead and writing. We also find a number of anachronisms in the collection. So, for instance, the reference in, I think it's in the book of Genesis, there is this reference to, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. In Genesis 12:6 and 13:7. At that time, it is of course clear that whoever is writing knows that the Canaanites are no longer there in the land. This would have been impossible for Moses to write, because in the internal logic of the story, Moses would have been writing before the Israelites come into the land of Canaan, when the land was still inhabited fully by Canaanite people. So let's talk about the documentary hypothesis. Documentary hypothesis, I want to emphasize, is a theory, it's a hypothesis, and the label comes from the idea that we have here complete documents that existed separately of each other, and then were somehow combined together by editors. The theory comes from the 19th century in its most developed form, although prior to that there were steps that were taken that had suggested dealing with the evidence in the Pentateuch, suggesting that it could not have all been written by one individual. And that evidence that the individuals that actually had talked about that goes back all the way to the Middle Ages, by people that said, well, this could not have been the case, or here we have evidence, we have traces of different collections. This theory actually is able to deal with the repetitions that we find, the contradictions, and so forth. And although there have been some challenges in the last few years, for the most part the theory still holds and is widely seen as a way of dealing with this literature in the scholarly community. What are those sources? So we have here the J source from the German Yahweh or Yahweh. It is a source that uses the proper name of God, Yahweh. So we find it, for instance, in the second creation story in Genesis 2:4 to the end. The second one is the E, or the Elohist tradition, uses the generic word Elohim for God. And today it is believed that this source was, for the most part, oral rather than a written document. D stands for the Deuteronomist. As you may surmise, most of it is found in the book of Deuteronomy. And this source is said to come from the time of King Josiah, when there was a reformation, a renovation of the temple, and a reformation of Judean religion. And this source then somehow may have been written to give support to those reforms. And then we have the priestly source, is probably the one that was written last. The Judeans were in exile in Babylon in the 6th century, and then priestly editors actually are the ones that put the final touches in the entire collection, so that the entire Torah actually has traces of priestly concerns and priestly editing in it. I think that's it as far as an introduction to the Pentateuch is concerned. So happy reading.